Good morning. I know we're just right on the nose here. I want Dr. Longman to have plenty of time to speak. Wanted to welcome you to our Deer Lectures. Twice a year we do lectures. In the fall, I believe it's the Hester Lecture Series for preaching. In the spring, we do the Deer Lectures. These Deer Lectures are intended to bring people of good academic standing to come and share with us out of their research in the areas of biblical studies, theology, and church history. And I want you to know how excited I am that we have Dr. Longman here. I'll share something about that in a moment, but I want to call us to prayer first. Father, thank you so much for the opportunity to study and to learn, Lord, for the furtherance of your kingdom. Lord, thank you that you sent your Son to die to bind us all together, your Spirit to give us the purpose and the focus. Lord, thank you for the world we live in that you created. So, Lord, I want to pray this morning that as we look at how these ideas and truths are communicated through the Old Testament into Jesus Christ, Father, I want to pray that our hearts would be stirred and that our knowledge would just be improved. In Jesus' name, amen. I came to know Dr. Tom, and he doesn't know that I came to know him this way, but when I was a PhD student at Southwestern, I was assigned the topic of studying form criticism. And my initial reading in that was driving me deeper and deeper into depression because it just didn't seem to fit any paradigms that I wanted or anything. And then I came across this article in the Westminster Theological Journal, Form Criticism, Recent Developments in Genre Theory and the Evangelical. And I went and I mentioned it to my professor, said, have you ever heard of this Tremper Longman? Oh, yeah, you really ought to read him. And I have. He's, as you saw up there, over 30 works published. His Old Testament introduction has been one that I've used year in and year out. Many of his publications have influenced what I've done. And one of the things that I really love and appreciate is that everything he writes, you detect a love for the church, for a love of the communication of the gospel and a love of communicating the word of God to people. That's the guy we've got speaking today. His topic is what was said in the scriptures concerning himself, Luke 24:27, reading the Old Testament as a Christian, which is something we all do, hopefully, right? So I won't take any more of your time. I want to invite Dr. Longman and give him the floor.
Thank you very much, and it's wonderful to be here, and I very much respect Gateway Seminary, though I'm still having trouble. I often say Golden Gate still, but it's been wonderful to be a part of the doctoral curriculum here as well. And so I went into Old Testament studies about 40 years ago under the influence of the person that I ended up writing that Old Testament introduction with, Raymond Dillard. And I went into Old Testament rather than New Testament for a couple reasons. One is everybody who was graduating from Westminster Theological Seminary before me were going into New Testament, like Wayne Grudem and Vern Poythress, and we could name Andrew Lincoln, a whole bunch of other people. So I thought, going to be no jobs in New Testament. But really, the more noble reason why I went into Old Testament studies was because I knew that Christians struggled with the complexity and the relevance of the Old Testament. Yeah, as Dr. Watson says, we all read it as Christians because we're Christians, but the question is, do we read it correctly as Christians? And so that's what I'm going to be addressing today, that one of these struggles that lead to the complexity and the question of relevance of the Old Testament has to do with the issue of continuity between the Old Testament and the New Testament. We know there's continuity when Jesus says something like in Matthew 5:17-20, that not a jot or tittle of the law will pass away until it is accomplished. On the other hand, we know there's discontinuity because we haven't been doing animal sacrifices as part of our religious services. So that we know there's continuity and discontinuity, but the question is how much of continuity and where are the areas of discontinuity? And if you look at the landscape within evangelical Protestantism over the past 40, 50 years, you can see extremes on both sides. You can see extreme represented by a viewpoint that was known as theonomy or Christian Reconstructionism, which emphasized continuity to a very high point. On the other side, you have some scholars who I would charge of being practical Marcionites, referring to the preacher from Alexandria around 250 AD who said the Old Testament is no longer canonical for Christians. Now, no one within evangelical Protestantism goes that far, to say the least, but it is the case that that some people treat the Old Testament with such a level of discontinuity that it ultimately becomes almost irrelevant. So I'm going to focus in on one particular question of continuity and discontinuity. My focus today is on where is Jesus in the Old Testament. This question affects how we as Christians should read it and how we as Christian preachers should preach the Old Testament. And of course, I'll start by citing Jesus himself. It's always very impressive to be able to cite Jesus in order to support your position on this. And fortunately, in Luke chapter 24, we have Jesus in the period of time between the resurrection and ascension talking to his disciples in this brief period of time. And according to Luke 24, he had one burning issue on his mind. And it warms the heart of an Old Testament scholar like myself to say it has to do with hermeneutics of the Old Testament, how Christians should read it. And as you know, in the first episode, you have Jesus walking with the two disciples on the road to Emmaus. And they don't recognize him because God keeps them from recognizing him. And they're sharing their depression, their sadness over their dashed hopes because their leader had just died in Jerusalem. And so Jesus turns to them and says, this is Luke 24, verses 25 to 27, "How foolish you are, and how slow to believe all that the prophets have spoken. Did not the Messiah have to suffer these things and then enter his glory?" And beginning with Moses and all the prophets, he explained to them what was said in all the scriptures concerning himself. All the scriptures concerning himself, not some isolated messianic prophecies. The law and the prophets, which is one way in which first century Jews referred to what we call the Old Testament. And then, of course, you come later, Jesus is addressing a broader group of disciples, and to them he says in verses 44 to 45, he says, "This is what I told you while I was still with you. Everything must be fulfilled that is written about me in the law of Moses, the prophets, and the Psalms." Then he opened their minds so they could understand the scriptures. So this is a second way in which, of course, first century Jews referred to the Old Testament, the law, the prophets, and the Psalms, Psalms being the first book and the third part of the Tanakh, the Ketuvim, namely the writings. Again, Jesus couldn't be more clear in that all the Old Testament scriptures anticipated his coming. Now, this situation leads to the present debate as to whether Christ's presence in the Old Testament was something that could have been discerned ahead of time, or whether Christ's death and resurrection was prerequisite to seeing Christ in the Old Testament. In other words, Was Jesus coming something expected, or was it a surprise that could only happen after the fact? Now, Greg Beale, presently at Westminster Seminary, is perhaps the strongest advocate of the view that the messianic expectation of the Old Testament should have been expected, and that the Old Testament authors themselves were aware of the messianic sense of their words. I think there's something funny about my ear. I always have trouble with these ear mics, so just excuse me. Yeah, I think I'll just do that. So, all right. Yeah, exactly. Now, Greg Beale, I'll call him Greg because he's a friend of mine, even though, as you'll see, I'll disagree with him here. He thinks that the New Testament authors occasionally will cite Old Testament texts. Well, let me put it this way. So he's very aware that when he looks at how the New Testament cites the Old Testament, that when you look at the Old Testament context, it's rather surprising. And he's also aware of the fact, and I'll emphasize this a little bit later as well, that at the time of the death and resurrection of Christ, there weren't a whole bunch of people sitting around going, according to plan, we knew this was how it was going to play out. What we could say in terms of the first century audience, as we read the New Testament, is that it was a surprise to them. So Greg, though, is a very much a defender of the idea that the human authors were conscious of the meaning of their words. So he's invented a phrase called cognitive peripheral vision. So what he says is that even if it's difficult for us to see how the New Testament author could have derived the meaning of this Old Testament text as they're citing it in the New Testament, we have to believe that it is a part of, again, their cognitive peripheral vision. In other words, it's not the central meaning of their text, but it is something that they were aware of. Now, on the other side, you have scholars like Peter Enns and Richard Hayes. They represent the other end of the spectrum. They say this, that the significance, the messianic significance of the Old Testament can only be understood in the light of the death and resurrection of Christ. Now, this is where we get the two key phrases that many people put at war with each other, Christological and Christotelic. Now, you Greek students know well that Christological means that there's something of the essence there, that the meaning is resident within the Old Testament itself, whereas Christotelos, picking up on the Greek word telos, or goal, purpose, means that no, it's not sort of resident in the meaning of the text so that the Old Testament people of God could understand its full significance, but rather it is the telos that can only be seen after the death and resurrection of Christ. And as I say, you could go and look at the rather heated interchanges between particularly Beale and Enns on this subject. My own view is both and. Both and. That is, yes, there was enough in the Old Testament itself so that the people of God should have known. And the reason why I say that is because notice how Jesus begins his comments to the two disciples on the road to Emmaus. He doesn't say, hey, I get it. Now that you know I've been raised. No, he says, how foolish you are and how slow of heart. In other words, you should have known. But on the other hand, it's also true that the full significance of the Old Testament could only be understood in the light of the death and resurrection of Christ. How else should we explain that really no one seemed to get it. So I don't think Enns and Hayes take account of the how foolish are you. And I don't think, on the other hand, I don't think Beale and others like him are right because they resort to a rather desperate measure when they appeal to this idea of a peripheral cognitive vision. And it also allows us to affirm the fact that the prophets often spoke better than they knew. They always spoke truly, but they didn't always understand the full import of their words. All we have to do is look at John the Baptist, by the way. Real quickly, John the Baptist is the one who, of course, recognizes Jesus the Messiah. He baptizes him. And you'll remember that John announced that the Messiah would be one who would, gather all the chaff and burn it with unquenchable fire. He would take the axe and bring it to the rotten wood. And then after he baptizes Jesus, Jesus goes out, he heals the sick, he preaches the good news, he exorcises demons. John the Baptist is in prison. He hears these reports and he goes, I think I might have baptized the wrong guy. So in Matthew 11, he sends 2 disciples up to Jesus with the question, are you the one or should we expect another? Now, John the Baptist didn't understand the full import of his words. He spoke truly, but what he didn't know, what wasn't in even his cognitive peripheral vision, was the idea that Jesus was coming not once, but twice. So I talk more about this in my forthcoming book. I have to drop at least one promo called Wrestling with the Old Testament, Confronting the Challenges of Evolution, Divine Violence, Historicity, and Sexuality. Now that I'm retired, I can offend everybody. Okay. So where does such a position leave us for our interpretive practice? How should a Christian read the Old Testament? How should a Christian preach the Old Testament? Well, the first thing that I would insist on is that we should all, in our first reading of the Old Testament, listen to what Brevard Childs called the discrete voice of the Old Testament. And that allows us, to borrow a phrase from Walter Brueggemann, to appreciate what he called the wild and untamed theological witness of the Old Testament. In other words, we shouldn't rush immediately to a New Testament perspective on the Old Testament text, but we should dwell in the Old Testament context and ask ourselves, what can we learn about God? What can we learn about our relationship with God as we identify with the implied readers of these Old Testament texts? Let's remember, as my friend John Walton puts it, that the books of the Bible, while written ultimately for us, were not written to us. They were not written to us. Every book of the Old Testament, New Testament as well, was written to a very specific audience for a very specific purpose, utilizing cultural, first of all, the Hebrew language, which we have to translate in order to even read it in English, but also ancient metaphors, ancient literary styles, and so forth. So in the first place, we need to study the Old Testament in its original context. And that will keep us from some egregious Christological readings. And I think one of the reasons why some people avoid either Christological or Christotelic readings, and let's remember that, I haven't mentioned that, there are plenty of evangelicals who push against this idea of any type of Christological reading. 2 of my very good friends, for very different reasons, are in this camp, John Walton and John Goldengay. They both think that if we do any kind of Christological appropriation, that somehow we miss this first and important discrete witness of the Old Testament. So, for instance, when somebody reads Ecclesiastes 4:12, though where Kohelet or the teacher is talking about relationships and the importance of relationships, he concludes this section by saying, though one may be overpowered, two can defend themselves. A threefold strand will not be quickly broken. And, going back to Ambrose, you'll find interpreters who say that's some kind of reference to the Trinity. Or even at weddings, sometimes this verse is quoted as, you need Jesus in your marriage. This is an inappropriate Christological reading, which can be easily avoided by, first of all, asking how was this text understood in the ancient context? Or say, as you read the tabernacle, about the tabernacle, what's its significance for the New Testament? Well, Paul Keeney, in a very popular book, at least it was popular 30 years ago, talked about how the blue color within the tabernacle represents Jesus' royal status, or that the welcoming entrance to the tabernacle, as it's described in the book of Exodus, is Jesus' welcoming arms to us. And we could go on. Song of Songs 113 was famously interpreted for over 1,000 years within the Christian church. The Song of Songs 113 is, my lover is to me a sachet of myrrh lodged between my breasts. And in commentary after commentary through the Middle Ages into the early modern period, that was interpreted to be a reference to Jesus, is the sack of myrrh, who spans both the Old and the New Testaments. Okay, so unless you're careful and read it within its Old Testament context first, you're going to too quickly jump into that type of Christological reading. And there are examples of that today. If you look at the Brazza's commentary series, not all the commentaries there, but many of them adopt this kind of immediate Christological interpretation. So again, that's the first thing we should say. I do have an interesting quote, though, from a Jewish scholar. You might think that Jewish scholars are particularly negative about the type of Christological reading that we do. And indeed, that's one of the reasons I think John Goldengay avoids it. He doesn't want to offend Jewish scholars by appropriating the Old Testament and turning it into a Christological text. But listen to John Levinson of Harvard, where he says, quote, Christian exegesis requires that the Hebrew Bible be read ultimately in a literary context that includes the New Testament. To read it only on its own would be like reading the first three acts of Hamlet as if the last two had never been written. So here you have a Jewish scholar who's saying Christians need to read the Old Testament in two ways. The first reading should be in its Old Testament context. The second reading, though, should be in the full light of what we know about Jesus in the New Testament. So I thought, let's see, I think we have about 10, 12 more minutes. Oh, thanks. I got the president to say, take your time. I was told 35 minutes. And no. So I'll be reasonable here. But you'll notice on your outline, I have 3 examples that I want to give of a first reading and a second reading. But I said select one if time was running. So I'll see how many I can do. Yeah, or 2, right. So I think that I'll start with Ecclesiastes as an example, because Ecclesiastes may not be the most obvious place where you could do a Christological reading. And also, I think this will be a good example because what I'm not saying is that you can lift up 2 or 3 or 4 verses and find a distinctive Christological or Christotelic meaning here. That in the case of the book of Ecclesiastes, the whole book has, in my opinion, one trajectory into the New Testament that's relevant for all the different parts of the book of Ecclesiastes, but it's not as if there are discrete kind of Christological readings of them. And by the way, I use Christological and Christotelic sort of interchangeably because of my view. All right, so on a first reading of Ecclesiastes, we have a book where there are two voices. The one voice is that of Kohelet in Hebrew, typically translated either the teacher or the preacher, though the Hebrew means neither of those. It means one who assembles a group. But that's not important for what we're doing this morning. What is important is the message of the teacher. So this runs from 1:12 to 12:7. And the teacher's message is, life is difficult, and then you die. Okay? To put it in one sentence, that's the teacher's perspective. Life is difficult. Life is meaningless, and he gives reasons why. First of all, it's meaningless because you die. You can amass all the money in the world, but ultimately it's not meaningful because you die and you can't take it with you. You can have all the fun in the world, all the pleasure in the world, but you die, and on and on and on. Even wisdom. In chapter 2, he reflects on wisdom and folly and says, hey, wisdom's better than folly in that it allows you to navigate life pretty well. But in the end, the wise man dies, has the same fate as the fool. So death renders life meaningless to the teacher. The teacher has no conception of the afterlife. Secondly, injustice in this life renders life meaningless. And he reflects in chapter 7, verse 15 and following about how the wise man sometimes dies young, and the fool may live to be old. And so what value is there in wisdom? There's no justice in that. And he goes on to give some pretty bizarre advice from, at least in terms of the standard biblical teaching. He says, don't be too righteous, and don't be too wicked. That's kind of a waste of time. So injustice in this life as well. And then also, and this is a little bit more technical, the teacher believes that while God has created everything according to its right time, chapter 3, that beautiful poem, a time for this, a time for that. But then if you read the following verses, he gets frustrated because though God has created everything according to right time, he hasn't let us in on it. So for all those reasons, life is meaningless. Fortunately, he's not the only voice in the book of Ecclesiastes. The second wise man, who's not given a name, but who's talking to his son, notice in chapter 12, verse 12, he's talking to his son. And he's saying to his son, and I'm paraphrasing here, and of course my commentary on Ecclesiastes gives the technical defense of this interpretation. He's saying to his son, the teacher is 100% correct. Life is difficult, and then you die. As long as you stay under his parameter, which is under the sun. Remember, the teacher keeps talking about life under the sun, life apart from the revelation of God. And then he goes on at the very end, famously, to give his son what I would call an above-the-sun perspective. Fear God, obey the commandments, and live in the light of the future judgment. And so what he's saying to his son is put God first. Don't try to find meaning in wisdom. Don't try to find meaning in pleasure. Don't try to find meaning in work or money or whatever. You can only find meaning if you put God first. So as I read the book of Ecclesiastes, I think of it as an idol buster. It's an idol buster. What it's doing, it's undermining any attempts to find the meaning of life apart from God. But if you put God first, then maybe those other things can find their proper place. Jerome wrote a very influential commentary around 400 AD where he used Ecclesiastes as a kind of tract for the monastic lifestyle, No, that's not what the book is trying to say. It's not an anti-creational kind of book. It's a book that's saying, put God first, and all these other things can find their proper place. So that's what I would call a first reading of the book of Ecclesiastes. And that has, I think you can agree with me, a very important abiding relevance for us today. Because all of us, every person, is, as Calvin said, a factory of idols. We're constantly manufacturing idols that push Jesus out of the center of our life. And we need this reminder daily. But what about from a New Testament perspective? And here we should go to Romans chapter 8, verse 18 and following. Sorry, it'll take me just a second to get there. So here, Paul, in one of, I think, his most theologically profound statements, though he has a lot of theologically profound statements, said, I consider that our present sufferings are not worth comparing with the glory that will be revealed in us. For the creation waits in eager expectation for the children of God to be revealed. For the creation was subjected to frustration. Now, it's this word frustration I want to focus in on for a moment. And in Greek, it's mateotes. And this is the word that Greek translation uses to translate the Hebrew word hevel in the book of Ecclesiastes. Hevel is the one that's translated meaninglessness in most English translations. So Paul is saying, yes, the creation was subjected to frustration, not by its own choice, but by the one who subjected it. And of course, this is a reference to God. God subjected the world to frustration. When did he do that? He did that in Genesis 3, after humanity rebelled against God, and God punished the world. So that's why the world was subjected to frustration. Now notice, when you go back and read Ecclesiastes in light of this teaching, what you learn is the teacher's trying to find the meaning of life under the sun, in other words, in a fallen world. No wonder he's coming up empty all the time. But Paul doesn't stop there. That's where the teacher stops. The teacher stops, gets frustrated with God and with life. But Paul goes on to say, not by its own choice, but by the will of the one who subjected it, in hope that the creation itself will be liberated from its bondage to decay and brought into the freedom and glory of the children of God. Wow. God subjected it in hope for future redemption. And then when we read the book of Ecclesiastes in light of the New Testament, we see how that redemption is being accomplished in Jesus Christ, who subjected himself to the fallen world. Read Philippians 2. And by the way, I'm only doing one, just so people don't get nervous who are in Philippians 2. Have the same mindset as Christ Jesus, who being in very nature God, did not consider equality with God something to be used for his own advantage. Rather, he made himself nothing by taking the very nature of a servant, being made in human likeness and being found in appearance as a man. He humbled himself by becoming obedient to death, even death on a cross. So Jesus subjects himself to death. That probably major thing, the main thing that rendered life meaningless to the teacher. And then we read in verse 9 through 11, therefore God exalted him to the highest place and gave him the name that is above every name, that at the name of Jesus every knee should bow in heaven and on earth, and every tongue acknowledge that Jesus Christ is Lord, to the glory of God the Father. So think about it just real quickly. Jesus, as he approached the end of his life, was first of all greeted by the great crowds, the triumphal entry, but soon they deserted him. And that as he approached the cross, his disciples were nowhere to be found. Judas betrays him. Peter denies him. But when he's hanging on the cross, he cries out, my God, why have you forsaken me?" God redemptively, and in love, I would argue, withdraws his special presence from the Son, and the Son dies, feeling the heaviness of the meaninglessness of a fallen world, like Kohelet, the teacher, couldn't even imagine. But then he defeats death, and by defeating death, renders our lives meaningful. So that's one example of many that we could give that involves a first and second reading of the text. We should, in conclusion, always read the discrete voice of the Old Testament, but always ask, how does this anticipate Christ? And as a short note, let me say more and more resources are being developed that will help pastors think through these type of Christological readings. And if I could do one more promo, I'm the general editor of a new series of Old Testament commentaries called the Story of God Commentaries, and they're just starting to come out right now. My Genesis is out, and Proverbs by Ryan O'Dowd is out, and Paul Evans' Samuel's about to come out. Wendy Witter's Daniel's is already out, et cetera, et cetera. So they'll be coming out two a year. And this will be the first Old Testament commentary that will consistently adopt this kind of two reading of the Old Testament series, and is specifically written for pastors. Because when we preach from the Old Testament, this type of approach allows us to present the gospel as we preach the Old Testament. It allows us to hold up Christ. Christian proclamation in the Old Testament will always, in my opinion, or should always, in my opinion, take into account the end of the story of the grand narrative of the Bible, because in an important sense, the whole Bible is about Jesus.